Welcome back to Instant Book Talk. This week we read the first half of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Since we're about halfway through the story, let's have a quick chat to talk about what we think. And next week, we'll talk about the story in its entirety. As you can probably tell, I'm a big fan of Gothic horror. I love how it dances on the line between science fiction and fantasy. It speaks to a time when technology was advancing so rapidly that anything felt possible, which is why it feels especially relevant today. We live in a time period where science is moving at such a breakneck speed that we as a culture are forced to grapple with moral questions about the application of emergent technologies and how the decisions we make today will affect the world we live in tomorrow. At its core, this is a story about such a choice, but no spoilers. We'll talk about that more next week. For now, let's dig in and discuss the story so far. This story follows a very common but effective plot structure that lends itself well to the short story form. Stevenson spends about a page describing our protagonist and very neatly setting up the ordinary world in which he lives, which is to say, his status quo. He does this through rapid narrative summary with very little action to support the claims he makes about the protagonist, Mr. Utterson. The story's opening sentence identifies our protagonist, Mr. Utterson, and gives us a hint as to the perspective from which the story will be told. But it doesn't even suggest the conflict or the setting. Instead, we're given a description of a disagreeable sounding Mr. Utterson that ends with a contradiction. And it's that contradiction that gives this opening line the motive force that propels us into the narrative at large. Then, from the moment we clear those first two paragraphs, we're thrust directly into the inciting incident. This is the moment when Utterson's status quo is shaken. Now, Stevenson does this very skillfully by introducing Ensfield's story of the door before introducing Utterson's knowledge of Jekyll's peculiar will. It's this discovery of the will at the end of the chapter which propels us into the next chapter. If Stevenson had reversed this, which he absolutely could have done, considering Ederson already knows about the will when the story begins, we would have had that punch at the beginning, and then the story would have fizzled through the rest of the chapter, giving the reader very little need to move on to the rest of the story. From there, we watch Utterson follow a logical set of steps in his determined efforts to help his friend Jekyll out of this perceived jam. Yet as he digs deeper into this mystery, he's plagued by this nagging fear that his friend is more involved in Hyde's crimes than he'd really like to believe. We see this perspective shift at the first disaster, when Hyde murders Utterson's friend and client, Sir Danvers Carew. However, his shifting opinions of Jekyll come to a head at the midpoint of the story, where we end part one. This is when Lanyon confesses that he's been so shocked by Jekyll's mysterious actions that he's actually welcomes death, and in fact does die. Here at this midpoint disaster, we see the classic turning point, which is a hallmark of this particular story structure, in which our protagonist, Utterson, clearly wants to leave Jekyll and his link to the murderous Hyde behind, as evidenced by his relief when Jekyll won't see him any longer. But he also feels a strong obligation to his friend, as that's his core value. And this chapter leaves us without any real answers as to how Utterson resolves this inner conflict. And it's this nebulousness, this mystery of how he chooses to move forward through this turmoil that drives us into the second half of the story. Let's take a quick break from our story to help you find your next great read. Do you like dark fantasy fiction? If you do, check out my Kindle Vella series, The Tyranny of Fate. It's heavily inspired by D&D, the Cthulhu mythos, epic adventures like the Stormlight Archive, Edgar Allan Poe's gothic horror, noir mysteries like Sin City and the Maltese Falcon. It follows former soldier and fugitive Okimata Ramsey. Haunted by a betrayal he knows he'd commit again, Okimata wants nothing more than to escape his past. But when bounty hunters show up to collect his reward, he's forced to throw his lot in with a divination cult bound for the far west. It's a choice that has repercussions that span all of existence. Check it out now on Kindle Vella. New episodes drop every Saturday, and you can read the first three episodes for free. Thanks for listening, and now back to the story. Okay, let's talk character. Our protagonist is one Mr. Utterson, who at the beginning of the narrative is described to us as austere with himself, but generous and non judgmental with his friends. However, in the inciting incident, Utterson is confronted with a conundrum. His longtime friend has made a mysterious and puzzling alteration to his will. The beneficiary, one Mr. Hyde, was unknown to Utterson, but suddenly takes on the guise of a dangerous villain and an imminent threat to Jekyll's life. That's our external conflict here. Utterson's internal conflict arises when he seeks to investigate on his friend's behalf and then is told in no uncertain terms to butt out. What is Utterson to do? His love of his friends won't let him drop the issue, but his non judgmental nature won't let him force it with Jekyll either. So now he finds himself in a place where, to help his friend, he must act against his friend's wishes. Now, Stevenson shows us that Utterson doesn't wrestle too much with this particular inner conflict, as whenever new information arises, he never fails to act. Yet the conflict deepens in an unforeseen direction when Utterson begins to suspect Jekyll's involvement and is forced to contend with his desire to help a friend and the personal austerity that demands he upholds justice. For me, this is top tier character development. We have a protagonist who values his friends above all other things, and that's pitted against another core value, his desire to be non judgmental. But even as Utterson overcomes this first conflict, it only drives him deeper into a more profound inner conflict, the choice between his friends and his own integrity. This two stage evolution is what makes Utterson such a powerful character in the story, despite his rather bland attributes, at least for me. Our antagonist, on the other hand, is somewhat more nebulous. Hyde is the obvious bad guy initially, but he disappears rather quickly. Still, Hyde's disappearance marks only a brief reprieve from Jekyll's woes, and this forces us to ask two questions. One, where did Hyde go? Two, if Hyde isn't the real villain, then who is? These are questions that are left unanswered in the first half of the narrative. Even assuming that Hyde is the true villain of the story, his motives are inscrutable. He seems to act completely irrational in one moment and then violently chaotic in the next. We're never really given a glimpse of what drives him to do the things that he does. As such, he's left as an elemental manifestation of evil, not unlike a watered down version of the Joker. In part two, we'll learn more about Hyde's motives, but for now, he remains an enigma. There's a certain universality to the story setting. Stevenson chooses London as the backdrop, but frankly, the story could have taken place in any modern city of that period or beyond. The closeness, the fog, and the decay of the urban environment are really the only factors that impact the story itself. Stevenson uses a few of these details from each locale to help set the mood. For example, the inciting incident is triggered by the sight of a derelict door on an otherwise handsome street. Hyde's evil is manifest in the dingy, mean spirited neighborhood in which he lives. And Jekyll's secretive nature is elicited by the brooding, hearth lit dark of his chambers. But none of the narrative is specifically bound to London. This gives the setting a minimalist feel that doesn't crowd the spotlight, yet provides enough rooting to give the reader a sense of place in each of the scenes. Whew, that is a lot to pack into the first half of a short story. So let's go ahead and pin our talk there. Next week, we'll complete the story, pick up where we left off with plot, characters, and setting. We'll also expand our discussion to include themes, the impact of point of view, writing style, and pacing. Thanks again for joining me this week, and I look forward to seeing you next time.